Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So I've been requested to do an update on my 5 questions. This should be part 6. And I haven't done one of my 5 questions videos for quite a while now. So looking back at the previous one and the ones before that, I noticed that there were a few popular questions in the last one, part 5 I did. But actually there were some even more popular questions which I haven't yet addressed in older videos as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer 2 questions that came under the comments in part 5, and then I'm going to look at 3 questions from older editions of the 5 questions with Matt Easton videos. And also bearing in mind that when you're commenting underneath this video, feel free to put whatever questions you would like answers to, or you think might be interesting or illuminating for other people to hear about. But additionally, sometimes I won't just pick the question which has necessarily got the most upvotes, the most thumbs up, the most likes. I will sometimes just pick a question because I think it's really worthwhile answering it, even if it wasn't that popular in the comments underneath, because this is not a democracy, this is a sort of dictatorship, but a benevolent one nevertheless. So on to the questions. So John Erickson asked, what are the relative, or if I could talk a little bit about the relative benefits and strengths and weaknesses of different shield materials. Now, this is very clearly a subject that I could talk about for hours and hours, but that would be incredibly boring for 99% of you. So I'll try and be as short and concise as possible. Shields, there's always or very often there's a trade-off between weight and therefore, well, let's say weight and protectiveness, okay? So therefore, we could make a shield which was, bulletproof and incredibly hardcore, but for the most part, certainly in historical periods where they didn't have modern plastics and polymers and Kevlar and stuff like this, pretty much the balance was between, do I need a shield which is really light and maneuverable and I can carry everywhere or move really quickly, or do I need a shield which is really, really protective and I don't need to worry about moving it around too much because it'll get put on a wagon and taken to somewhere for me and then I can deploy it. And so very simply, at the 2 extremes, you've got bucklers at one end. If we talk about medieval and Renaissance Europe anyway, you've got bucklers at one end and you've got pavises at the other end. Now, clearly, one is a pavis is a large, sometimes known as a tower shield, which I think is an AD&D thing, but a pavis is essentially a large, usually very heavy, very thick. I've handled some original 15th century pavises actually while I was in Austria, and some of them are fearsomely heavy actually, but they're not designed to be used as hand weapons. They're designed essentially to be like a mobile wall. So you've got, very heavy and immobile shields at one end of the spectrum, and then you've got very light shields, maybe small, that you can wear easily and carry literally anywhere and not worry about it, like a buckler. In one-on-one combat, very clearly, a shield that is both large and light is generally better. But to talk specifically about the question, it was about materials. Now, most shields throughout history, I would say it's fair to say, have been made of either wood or leather, or a mixture of those 2 things. There are exceptions. There are, of course, shields that have been made of metals of various sorts. There have been bronze shields which were just bronze. There have been bronze shields that had bronze plate on the front of probably either wicker or wood. Again, that's a subject we don't know an awful lot about due to the limited archaeological remains. There were shields which were made purely of wicker. There were shields which were made of wicker with leather on the front. There have been shields made of iron and steel as well in later centuries, in the 15th, 16th century. Of course, you get bucklers made of purely of metal, but you do get larger shields, particularly in 16th century Europe, but also in India and the Middle East. You get shields, fairly large shields made purely of steel as well. But I think it's fair to say that for the most of history, shields in most parts of the world have been made of wood of various sorts, usually plank construction, with a layer of canvas or leather or canvas and leather over the top of that to protect the wood and give it some stability and hold it all together. However, there have been shields made purely of hide, and in fact, you know, if we look at the Zulu shield is one of the most famous examples. There is also the Sudanese shields, and in fact many Indian shields, many dal used in India were in fact just thick cowhide, thick buffalo hide, or sometimes other types of hide. Occasionally hippo and rhino and elephant have been used as well, both in Africa and Asia. So you can make a shield or a buckler purely out of the skin of an animal, treated in different ways, sometimes layers, but certainly in Europe usually wood was the basis of the shield with thinner leather on top. Something to say about leather is that leather is actually quite heavy. If you, certainly in kind of LARPing communities and certain aspects of reenactment, leather has been used for armour, and the thing which always surprised me slightly is leather armour is actually quite heavy. And the same goes for shields. If you take a large Zulu shield made of a cow hide with a stick up the middle, it's actually not that light. In terms of the protectiveness balanced against weight, wood is pretty much a very good material to make a shield out of. Hide is quite good, but I would say in general the weakness of hide alone is that it can be penetrated by things like arrows and crossbow bolts. Of course bullets, but pretty much most shields can be penetrated by bullets, at least rifle bullets, maybe not pistol bullets. So generally speaking, if you're looking in a medieval European context, against crossbow bolts and arrows, they needed fairly thick shields made of wood with leather on the front. Whereas if you're looking at a South African context with the Zulu, for example, a shield that was made of hide with a stick up the centre was enough to deflect and prevent the penetration of an ikloa, or sometimes known as an assegai, stabbing spear, or indeed thrown spears most of the time, or a lot of the time should we say. And so in that context leather was enough, and it always comes down to protectiveness versus weight. And you really want, and this is something that, sorry reenactors, and you know, I'm an occasional reenactor myself, but this is one of the things that reenactors often get wrong, is they make their shields too heavy. And the reason for that is the way that shields are used in reenactment is quite different to how shields are used in real warfare. And apart from anything, reenactors want their shields to last fight after fight after fight after fight, whereas real shields, you pretty much want to make the shield as light as it can be to still protect you during that fight. And if it's trashed at the end of the battle or the end of the duel or whatever you're using it for, you throw it away and get a new one. They're pretty much disposable commodities, and we see this most famously in the Viking duels where they're allowed to have 3 shields each, and the expectation is they'll destroy these 3 shields. So there we go, that's a brief overview. But clearly shields can be made of many different materials. They can basically be made of anything. A shield is anything you use as a shield. But there's always this trade-off between protectiveness and weight. And I think generally speaking, you want a shield that is as convenient and light and manoeuvrable as possible, whilst providing just enough protection for what you need it to do. So on to the next question. So question number 2 comes from 77 Jarim, and he asks, he or she, I don't know, they ask, what were the differences between, or were there any differences between, fighting men from different European countries, say England, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, wherever, between 1200 and 1600? Well, again, much like the shield question, that is potentially a colossal topic, but I will try to be as brief as possible and say that generally speaking, probably no. In the grand scheme of things, human beings living in Europe between 1200 and 1600, so let's call it the Middle Ages, and early Renaissance, generally speaking, people were people. There wasn't really a big difference between a 15th century Italian and a 15th century English person. They shared many common cultural traits, and much was similar in their lifestyle. Really, the differences that there were between people in different places at that time were quite similar to the differences between people in different places today, i.e. they had slightly different diet, they had slightly different physical characteristics, you know, lighter skin as opposed to darker skin, maybe height average difference, you know, someone from Norway is on average taller than someone from Italy on average. But in terms of the type of jobs they did and their physical capabilities, these are much the same today, and these was much the same then. You know, we can have Olympic athletes from every European country today. There's no real marked difference between them, and you know, the same would have been true then. If we look at 14th or 15th century England, for one example, clearly there can be differences between a fighting man in England at that time and a fighting man in a certain part of Italy in that time, based on cultural differences. For example, in the 14th and 15th century in England, everybody, or lots of people, were very practiced with the longbow, and you know, English archers of that period were famous and still are famous today, and often referred to in my videos and other people's videos. So you could take specific examples and say, you know, you might find that there are a greater proportion of really good archers from England in the late 14th century than there are from northern Italy in the late 14th century. Conversely, you're very likely to find there are a greater number of available skilled crossbowmen from northern Italy than there are from England, from most parts of England in that time. So it really only, the differences between the countries really come down to cultural quirks and differences based on the government and military structures that were in place in those cultures at those times. And equally, 1200 to 1600 is quite a big time frame, and you know, if we look at 1600 and we look at 1200 just in London, England, then the cross-section of people you can draw upon for soldiers in 1200 compared to 1600 is fairly different. And in fact, the type of soldiers that were being recruited in those times were fairly different as well. And the military structures were completely different. The way that people were recruited and how long they were expected to serve for, where they might go, what they might do, what weapons they'd use, what kind of skills they'd bring with them, they were different. So there's a fair amount of change between 1200 and 1600, and there's differences between countries as well. So it's a very, very complex question, but I hope that goes a little bit towards exploring a possible answer to your big question there. Cheers. So for question 3, going back to a question that was very popular and posted underneath my previous, not my last, the one before that, 5 questions video that I did. And it's from Timmy Turner, and Timmy Turner asked, who would win, it's a nice simple question, who would win in a duel between someone with a greatsword and someone with a rapier? Based on the fact that rapier often has a reach advantage, and so therefore if that's negated by someone with a greatsword, who would win in the duel? Well, different people will have different views on this. I can only give my view. My view is the person with the greatsword, usually. The rapier's real advantage, and I hope I've made this clear in my previous videos, I don't think the rapier is a magic weapon. I don't think it's the European mythological katana. I just think that, well, I think and I find in my experience on a weekly basis that when you fight against someone with a rapier who has a distinct length advantage against you, and a very nimble and quick moving point, it's very, very difficult if you're using most other types of shorter sword. If, however, you switch that to a greatsword, which is really equatable more to a pole weapon, then the rapier loses its advantage. The rapier's big advantage is its reach. It's got good hand protection, it's got some other things going for it, it's got that nimble point, but ultimately the main real game-changing advantage the rapier has is its reach. If you get rid of that reach advantage by you using a spear, for example, a spear, I would I would hope, I would expect, wins 10 times out of 10 against a rapier. Unless, I mean, assuming the people are equal. And this is, in this discussion, we've always got to say, this is not a skill-based discussion. This is not an individual-based discussion. We're just comparing weapon with weapon. So we have to assume it's person X fighting person X, a clone of themselves. Okay? And in that situation, I expect spear to beat rapier every time. And really, greatsword versus rapier, yeah, I'd expect the greatsword to win. If the two people are equal and they're both equal with their weapons and they're both equally trained at fighting the other weapon as well, which is an important point, I would always put my money on the greatsword. Greatswords are scary freaking ass things, just as polearms are. And really, I want to reiterate, swords are generally not that good against polearms. It's not that you're hopeless against them. There are things you can do. If you're better than your opponent, you can beat them. But polearms are a real game changer, and greatswords really, in my mind, fall into the polearm category. So going all the way back to part 2 of my 5 questions series, there was a question from McFace who asked, what did left-handed people do in medieval and ancient periods with not wanting to mess up formations and holding their weapons the other way around? What did they do? Very short answer to this, we don't know. In actual fact, we know left-handed people existed. Left-handed people are mentioned in historical sources, and they're actually mentioned in the fencing treatises. The earliest example I'm aware of off the top of my head, there may be earlier ones, but the earliest example that comes to my mind is Manciolino in 1531, who gives advice both for the left-hander and how to fight left-handers. So it seems like it wasn't like completely stamped out. There were left-handed fighters around. I think for the large part, if you're dealing with sort of drafted or forced into service soldiers, conscripted soldiers, then perhaps if they were in a shield wall, for example, they would have been forced to hold their shield on the correct side. I can't imagine the Romans, for example, putting up with someone who held their scutum in their right hand and used their gladius or pilum in their left hand. It just wouldn't work. So I think in that kind of, if we take the Roman situation, I may be wrong, but common sense to me dictates that probably an organisation like the Roman military forced people to be right-handed. In the British Army in the 19th century, there are again mentions of left-handers, very, very occasional. You have to remember that the schooling system in the 19th century meant that lots of people who would have been naturally left-handed were forced to be right-handed. And even people of my grandparents' age were, in some cases, not maybe forced, but were strongly encouraged to be right-handed and discouraged from doing things with their left hand. I myself, a little known Matt Easton fact, write with my left hand, but I do pretty much everything else with my right hand, which in fencing and archery and shooting and everything else I've done has been really useful to me, because frankly, we have to be honest about it. Left-handers have a hard time in lots of things. In some sports it just doesn't matter, but generally in the world, in life, being left-handed I think is a bit of a disadvantage. So I've been always felt very grateful that I'm predominantly right-handed, even though I write with my left hand. But even writing with your left hand is a pain in the ass, because you're always dragging your hand across the writing and smudging it and this kind of stuff. So you know, using a pair of scissors, I'm very glad that I use my right hand for scissors, because they don't really work properly for left-handers and you have to get special scissors. And anyway, so I think historically, by and large, I think in organised military structures such as the Roman army, obviously in the the 1st century or 2nd century AD, or if we're looking at the British army in the 19th century, or indeed any other European army or any other American or any other organised army in the 19th century, then I think that a lot of soldiers, common soldiers, would have been forced to be right-handed. However, on an individual basis, when we're talking about fencing or duelling or these more individual activities, I think, left-handers went left-handed, and we know that there were plenty of left-handed fencers around because they're mentioned in the historical material. So the final question actually comes from part 1 of the 5-question series, so quite a long time ago now, from Leviathan's Steak, one word, and they ask, is there a particular reason that pommels on long swords, and by proxy I therefore presume that this person also means arming swords as well, and bastard swords and such like. Is there a reason that the pommels changed design as we moved through the medieval period? And this got a lot of thumbs up, a lot of upvotes, and I never got round to referring to it before. So here we go, this is that. Now, the reason that I didn't refer to it before is because I went, oh, that's a really cool question, that's really interesting. I don't know how to answer that. Now that's not totally true. It's not that I don't know how to answer it. It's that it's actually, again, like, and this is I suppose the theme of this edition of 5 Questions with Matt Easton, quite a difficult question to answer. By and large, it's very clear that certain types of pommel, for example, scent stopper pommels and fishtail pommels, came about because they're more comfortable to grip on a longsword. So with a wheel pommel, so there's a wheel pommel behind me. In fact, I'll grab it to demonstrate, and I've got a scent stopper I might look at in a minute as well. With a wheel pommel, with a one-handed sword, it works well because you're not ever gripping any part of the pommel. But as soon as we start to get hand and half swords and long swords, aka bastard swords, and you start gripping here, you find that a wheel pommel works okay, but what you gain with a scent stopper pommel, like that, is a bit of extra reach, essentially. So without having to make the total length of the sword more, it means that you can more, for a lot of people, more comfortably grip the hilt, essentially, further down. Now, there is one specific source which people who study German longsword like to quote a lot, that is sometimes known as Dobringer, aka A388. It's got a manuscript number from a catalogue. So let's not worry about it. Let's call it Dobringer for here. I can't remember the name. It's 3887A, I think. And that specifically says not to grip your pommel, and to grip instead, put this sword down for a minute and just demonstrate, to grip the handle and let the pommel swing freely as a counterbalance. However, the fact that they're saying that very clearly shows, as anybody who's done even basic level high school history, if they're saying to do that, it means, or saying not to do that, that means lots of people do that. Okay, so it's just like laws. You only need a law if someone is doing that thing you don't want them to do. There are no laws about riding on UFOs whilst wearing sequin tiaras, because no one rides on UFOs whilst wearing sequin tiaras, so they haven't had to make a law for it. However, there were laws in medieval England about not running fencing schools in the middle of a city, because people did run fencing schools in the middle of a city. So a law contravening, a law banning something doesn't mean that that thing didn't happen. It means that it definitely did happen, and they had to bring a law out. Now, therefore, because the fencing treatise says not to do this, certainly lots of people were doing this. And in fact, if we look at the other fencing treatises from that period and a little bit later, if we look at 15th century, both Italian and German treatises, we can see lots of people with their hands at the top and the bottom of the grip. Now, very clearly, if you're going to grip a longsword as far down as you possibly can, which I like to do, then a scent stopper pommel suits the shape of the grip very nicely. A wheel pommel doesn't suit it so well. However, wheel pommels didn't disappear, and they did remain on longswords, wheel pommels like this. And they're not too bad to grab. They're not uncomfortable. Certain styles of wheel pommel can be, with quite, you know, kind of, if they've got quite angular rims on them or whatever, edges. But this fairly fat rounded type is actually fairly comfortable, although this is a one-handed sword length, definitely. I can use this two-handed without any problem. It's not uncomfortable. It just means my index finger and thumb go around above the pommel, and then the rest of my hand, which shouldn't be gripping that tightly anyway, goes around the wheel pommel. Now, you would say, well, if that other type of scent stopper pommel was more comfortable for two-handed grips, why didn't they stop using wheel pommels on longswords entirely? Why do we still get some longswords which have wheel pommels? Well, quite simply, I think it's partly tradition. There was no reason not to have wheel pommels on one-handed swords, and if you if people have grown to like wheel pommels, then very clearly some people are going to go, well, I like wheel pommels, but I also like longswords, so I want a wheel pommel on my longsword. You can still use it. It doesn't stop me from using it as a longsword. Some other people might prefer a scent stopper pommel, but I'm fine with my wheel pommel. And I just really like wheel pommels, so I'm going to have a wheel pommel, and I don't care what you guys say. So quite clearly, there's no strong, it's a bit like evolution. If there's no strong reason for this to stop being used, then it will just continue being used. Wheel pommels have also an advantage that scent stopper pommels, or at least a lot of scent stopper pommels, don't have, and that is these can aid with edge alignment. So if you look, a wheel pommel is essentially a flat object. It's a wheel, okay? It's a disc in that direction, and it's more or less a rectangle in that direction, which means that actually the back hand is quite, you can feel the edge alignment, as well as being able to feel it at the cross end of the grip. You can also, up here, you can also feel it at the bottom end of the grip as well, which if you're ever doing one-handed actions, like sometimes you let go with the lead hand and cut just with the rear hand. This is a fairly rare action, incidentally. It's done sometimes in modern tournaments as a sneaky way of getting additional reach, but let's just say for the purposes of this video, if you do that, you can still feel the edge alignment with a wheel pommel when you can't with a scent stopper pommel. Fishtail pommels and the Sempak style pommel are kind of halfway between the two, because although in silhouette they look like a scent stopper, if you look at them that way in the plane of the edge, they're actually very flat. So with them you get the grip advantage of a scent stopper and you get the edge alignment advantage of a wheel pommel. So I hope I've mostly answered the question now. I think generally speaking, these types of pommels came along when people started gripping their swords with two hands more often. The wheel pommel was massively more massively more more prevalent. It was the more dominating style of pommel up until longswords started to appear. And then once longswords came along, we start to get diverse types of pommel. And then once those diverse types of pommel start to come along, then they're sometimes applied to one-handed swords as well. But ultimately, all of these pommels that you see historically, this isn't true of fantasy swords. There are many pommels on fantasy swords which just don't work. But all of the pommels that you see on historical swords work on one-handed swords or long swords. And therefore, if you've got, let's say, 20 different types of pommel that all work, then there's no reason for any of them not to exist. And people like variety in the medieval period just as now. And yes, there's certain people who like to conform, and they want to buy a Ford Mondeo because lots of other people in the street have a Ford Mondeo. And then you have the one person that wants to buy a Mazda RX-8 because no one in the street has a Mazda RX-8. Just different people are different. Some people like to conform, some people like to be different. And some people just think about practicalities, and some people will just buy a Ford Fiesta because they don't think, I don't need a car as big as a Ford Mondeo or as fast as a Mazda RX-8. A Ford Fiesta is fine for me. So just then as now, there are many reasons why people would choose different types of pommel. Sometimes practical, sometimes conforming to stereotypes, sometimes trying to be different and individualistic. So there we go, guys. I hope that has been an interesting 5 questions with Matt Easton, and please post your next questions underneath this video, and if there are some good ones, be it whether they get lots of thumbs up, and that does mean if something gets lots of thumbs up, then I will have to address it at some point, so long as it's not too silly, or equally just if it's a really good question that I think is really good, then I will hopefully answer it, if not in the next 5 questions edition, then the one after that. Cheers, folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.